president of the Architecture and Design Society at the Art Institute. And on behalf of Zoe Ryan, I welcome you all here to the Art Institute and, of course, to Chicago. You are, I think, the sort of banner at the beginning of what is going to be a fabulous year. As you know, we announced the Architecture Biennial on Tuesday, and we of course invite you all to come back in October for that project, that really sort of life-changing project for Chicago, that the Art Institute and the department is also a partner in. I will say, as a practitioner, as an architect, it's very intimidating to address all of you. I had a wonderful experience this last year to travel for 10 days with your colleague Ken Frampton to look at architecture as part of the America's Prize, the MChap. And what I really brought away from it is how important the voice that all of you bring to our physical world, to the practice. We need the perspective, we need the context, and frankly, we need the criticism. To hear Frampton and Pancho Lenoir, right in there aggressively, presenting the viewpoint that was much larger than the context of the individual project or its setting or even its city, really enlarged the project of architecture. And so I encourage you all to do what you do and to do it in a critical way, because we all benefit from that. So thank you all for being here. I also want to welcome you to the Art Institute in terms of our programs. We have Architecture Talks Back, Karen Keis's curation of contemporary architecture in dialogue with other mediums, and hope you'll have a chance to see that show. We're doing a dialogue on, on May 16th within the show, and then we have Mark Lee as our last speaker of the semester, I was going to say, with my academic hat on May 28th. And then, of course, the Art Institute is hosting the seminal exhibit of David Adjaye, which opens in September and will be also featured during the Architecture Biennial with a number of panels and discussions and visits around the exhibit. I'm also very pleased with Allison Fisher's co-chairing of the event that we could be, in the larger context of the department as well, the co-host for all of you here this weekend. And I hope that Chicago will be a great host for you. So without further ado, we're pleased to be here tonight to hear Professor Wright's speech. And I would like to introduce Ken Oshima, the co-chair of the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Dirk, and thank you to the Art Institute of Chicago. Welcome to the joining of the Society of Architectural Historians and the Architecture and Design Society. It's really wonderful to have this conversation, the dialogue, architecture talking back in many different ways, as we celebrate the Society of Architectural Historians' 75th anniversary. And cross that temporal boundary to look to the future 75 years of architectural history, what that might be. And I think there's no one better to help us think about that transition than Gwendolyn Wright, who was born here in Chicago and will speak this evening on the role of play, looking for patterns and crossing boundaries for our plenary talk. It's wonderful following the award ceremony for SAH, where she in 2012 was elected a fellow. So Gwendolyn Wright has truly been a pioneer in our profession, building on her undergraduate studies in history and art history at NYU, and then receiving a professional Master's of Architecture degree at UC Berkeley, before receiving her PhD in architecture at Berkeley as well, under the guidance of Spiro Kostoff in 1978. She published her first book, which is the first of 6, and many, many articles. Her first book, Moralism and the Model Home, Domestic Architecture and Cultural Conflict in Chicago, 1873 to 1913. That was in 1980, and amazingly published her second book in the next year, Building the Dream, A Social History of Housing in America. She was quickly snatched by Columbia University in 1983 and became the first female to gain tenure at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation there at Columbia, where I first met her in 1996 and myself entered the PhD program. Gwendolyn Wright is the recipient of many academic awards. In addition to being a fellow for the Society of Architectural Historians, she's received a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Getty Fellowship, and election to the Society of American Historians. In pushing beyond geographical borders of North America, Professor Wright has also written extensively about transnational exchanges, especially colonial and more recent neo-colonial aspects of both modernism and historic preservation, most notably in the 1991 book, Politics of Design in French Colonial Urbanism, that explores Morocco, Indochina, China, Madagascar, in this architectural historical exploration during the French colonial administration. Pushing beyond the real specialized academic circles, Dr. Wright is perhaps most popularly known as one of the history detectives, the tremendously successful PBS series for which she has been a co-host since 2003. Attracting professionals and the general public alike, the show reveals how historians track ideas and weigh conflicting evidence about what happened, why, and history's implications for the present, which we'll now contemplate at this most important juncture. Gwen, may I ask you to join us? At the end, we'll also have time for a few questions, but I'm told we need to leave here at 8:30, so people can have food and enjoy the rest of the evening. But Gwen, please join me.
I am so pleased and honored to be here. I'd like to give a special thanks to Ken and to Pauline, and to respond once again on all of our behalfs with congratulations to the recipients of tonight's awards, who are taking the field of architectural history in very exciting new directions. And I want to consider what some of those directions might be by bringing up a topic about history that we don't often talk about, the lightness as well as the seriousness. Now, what is history that all of us profess to know, but sometimes in the dark of night, we really wonder, how does it work? How much can we be in control of what we know? A few weeks ago, the intellectual historian Luc Menon published an article about historical thinking in The New Yorker, called Thinking Sideways. He contended that professional historians should acknowledge that there are always many different ways to organize what we've found and how we structure ideas. It's not as self-evident as we sometimes think or tell our graduate students. Menon argued that our categories tend to be a bit rigid. Epochs, decades, generations, or stylistic categories, and our explanations are perhaps sometimes even a bit facile. He singled out the recent books that some of you may have read, and they're fascinating at one level, but they suggest momentous changes in the world through the history of cod or salt or colors like mauve and indigo. Now, it seems to me that architectural historians sometimes fall prey to this. We evoke stylistic categories and groups. We evoke the avant-garde as if all of these terms were clear-cut. And we even presume that architecture always has the influence that the architect intended for it to have. Now, of course, we now investigate multiple realms that affect design. Whatever our subfield, We chart the intersection of social, cultural, intellectual, economic, political, and environmental histories, which isn't an easy crossroads. We make prodigious efforts to balance archival research, some of the various intentions and effects of the design of a building or a space on different groups of people, now getting beyond saying the public responded a certain way. We try to think about and take in with all of our senses what are the palpable experiences of buildings and places. And perhaps most elusive, we try to understand what resonates in making a creative work of architecture or design, whoever might have been the designer or the author. But history is not a puzzle. No one will ever have all the pieces, and there's certainly not a picture on the box that tells us how to solve it. So I'll pose a question that challenges some of our scholarly pretensions, but may open up a lot of pleasure. How can architectural and urban historians take some risks, play a little bit with what we find, imagine even wider and more unexpected ranges of sources and possible ideas and effects, some of which may not seem so serious at first glance? But then, is intellectual work always serious? After all, if the tech world can speak about the relevance of serious play, can't we think about playful work? It might be a good direction for us to go in. Now, by and large, the way we've taught architectural history has moved between two frameworks. On the one hand, the big ideas of concepts and aesthetic theories, and on the other, the presumed autonomy of individuals, Brunelleschi, Sinon, Doshi, Sullivan, Wright, Korb, and, thank heavens, now some collaborative teams, including the husband and wife team of Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi, who still deserve to get the Pritzker together. Now, a generation ago, in part to break this dichotomy between the big ideas and the major autonomous individuals, some authors began to take clients and public spheres into account. And I think one of the best books to do this was Alice Friedman's 1998 Women and the Making of the Modern House, which showed how female clients, such as Eileen Barnsdale working with Frank Lloyd Wright, and Truss Schroeder working with Rietveld, played a major role in the evolution of the design of their iconic modern houses in the 1920s. An early installation of the work about Hollyhock House appeared in the JSAH. This feminist incentive, daring for its time, strangely enough, joined with the themes that Alice would later infuse in her wonderful book on glamour. Now, there are countless examples that we might have looked to in terms of thinking about various ways to understand the ways that architecture has evolved and the different kinds of architecture that coexist. It seems to me that it's time for some architectural historian to get beyond what has been very exciting work about the counterculture in the 1960s and about architects' own houses, which are often very playful in terms of exploring their ideas about raising children and thinking about privacy and looking at the intimacy of a couple. But we still haven't taken on a really interesting challenge. What about those artists' lofts in Soho, in which architects weren't part of the radical transformation of notions of what was a modern aesthetic? These artists themselves, in part out of sheer necessity, but in part out of profound aesthetic ambitions, were changing modernism from being pure to being a little gritty, a little more hybridized, a balance of old and new, things that have become very important aspects of how we think about architecture, and modern architecture in particular, in the present day. Now, I admit, once I'd proposed this topic, I got a little nervous. And I thought, here I'm speaking to this august group, and they're going to think I'm really being kind of silly talking about play. But there are so many important books that have taken up topics that combined what was known, what was taken seriously, and what had been put to the side, what had seemed to be minor aspects of the evolution of architecture. Books like these two, to my mind, were raising new challenges about how architecture happens. And it's interesting that that word derives from the Old English hap, which meant luck. There is a certain amount of chance in how architecture happens. And some of us, as historians, need to play with those edges and see what we might find. Now, I thought that many of the august architectural historians would think that, well, the topic of play only refers to Italian gardens and to the Watts Tower, or things that seem to be outside of our realm. And yet, we can turn around and find ways that early work by Frank Gehry was drawing from and playing with the vernacular of Los Angeles that was part of googie coffee shops. There are interconnections which aren't necessarily direct causes, but are part of the wonderful way that we can play with a larger intellectual, cultural, and aesthetic context. Now, some of you may even wonder how I can take up what seems a frivolous topic like play when ISIS is destroying architectural monuments in the Middle East and the American housing crisis is causing devastation in this country. But I'm doing it for a large number of reasons. Because play is a realm of openness and serendipity and empathy among them. Play can help us see the world differently. It's a fundamental precedent for artistic creativity and often the unpredictable evolution of scientific knowledge. I'll give you an interesting parallel. The other day, one of my doctoral students told me that a friend of his who's in med school said that when they have gross anatomy, they name the cadaver, and then they give him or her a funeral when they're done. And that seemed a really wonderful way to make this body be more like a person who he or she once was, not just the organs and the tissues and the Latin names that they're working on. These days, apparently, in many schools, they do everything on an iPad, and so it may lose some of that human connection. And something similar happens, unfortunately, with many architecture students who no longer go out on construction sites. They don't learn to work with their hands, whether it's about high-rise construction or stick construction or prefab. They don't think about the ceremonies that construction workers have evolved over time. They don't explore what are the interconnections between the people who design, the people who make, and the people who live in and engage in, or sometimes are kept out of architecture. Now, we have exchanges, obviously, with other humanistic and social science disciplines, but there's still much for us to learn about creativity. We can turn, for instance, to psychologists who emphasize the paradoxical combination of play and discipline, humility and pride, passionate joy and objective self-criticism. I'll use archigram as an example because perhaps the best example of all was just feted, and that is Stanley Tigerman, who has brought a sense of playfulness and deep passion to everything that he's done. And these are ways that I think all of us, as historians, can try to see new possibilities. We can turn as well to the field of neuroscience, which challenges many of our presumptions about the workings of language, emotion, and visual perception. Eric Kandel has written extensively about how the world of perception and the arts come together, how different parts of the brain respond to and generate language. It's not all from a language section, that there are ways in which unconsciously listening and paying attention relate to different parts of your brain. So you can think about that when your students are not paying attention to your lecture, that they're actually taking it in all the same. Now, it seems to me that there are ways we can try to open ourselves up to thinking differently about knowledge, about beauty, and about the possibilities of joy. All too often, when architects talk about the games of architecture, they're suggesting a combat between vernacular and high art, for instance, which seems in many ways so dated, but it's still ongoing. With a few notable exceptions, the scholars who take on these two fields don't interact very much. Each side tends to defend its own territory and methods. Now, buildings and landscapes, I'm sorry, that just disappeared off. Well, there are books as well that look at this vernacular world of popular architecture, but Buildings and Landscapes is the journal of the vernacular architecture form, established in 1979, and this journal began to appear in 1985. It's scholarship that focuses on the vast realm of environments that were envisioned and built by non-professional designers. The homepage of the GSAH states that its distinguished history began in Harvard in 1940, and the mission statement emphasizes educating professionals and through them the larger public about the built environment and its role in shaping contemporary life. If wartime constraints of the 1940s meant that the journal was somewhat informal in its early years, it became not only very scholarly, but a little staid. There was a point at which my first SAH conference, I thought, do I really want to go into this field? It seemed as if there were so many controls over how we should work, what we should say. And then that began to open up. It really, I think, took a major change in the 1980s, and I really believe that one article, Dan Bluestone's prize-winning article about the city beautiful in Detroit and the role of businessmen, why they wanted to have this aesthetic, opened up new ways of thinking about patrons, new ways of thinking about the meaning of beauty for different groups in that city. The JSAH changed even more radically at the end of the 1990s under Yves Blau, who commissioned articles like these, looking at working class housing and the potential use of computer tools. There were articles about the power relations of colonial architecture. And a new, younger generation of historians ventured into these realms, changing the way that we did architectural history in the process. Scholars were staking out new terrains and often showing a bit of wit and playfulness as they engaged intellectual, political, and aesthetic controversies. Yet this was still, by and large, rather serious, a debate about the truth of how buildings and spaces evolved, and which ones were the most relevant or important. Well, perhaps it's time to venture a little farther afield. Psychologists, cognitive scientists, biologists, social scientists all agree that play is essential to human development. And they're not just speaking about children. They're looking at all of us. Venturing into the mental terrains of play entails moments of suspending judgment, imagining alternative explanations that may not go anywhere, being willing to be wrong, exploring uncharted terrains rather than worrying about what is correct. That can be quite a challenge for scholars. Play also helps diffuse tensions and conflicts. It stimulates the neurons in the brains and diminishes our sometimes exaggerated sense of ourselves. Being outside of normal activities frees us to recognize new insights, much like the world of dreams, which, of course, are often bizarre. Things happen in dreams that don't make any sense. And we've learned to draw meaning from those. And we can do the same with thinking about the ways that words come together, the ways that architecture might have been considered in the process of something being evolved. Now, in thinking about architecture and play, I should mention that there is a National Museum of Play in Rochester, New York, established in 1969. But the exhibitions and the two major expansions have all been funded by generous gifts from toy makers. So that's not what I'm recommending. Instead, I think that we, as architectural and urban historians, would find some real benefits from using a more playful approach to think about the lives, the practices, the dreams, the ways that invention happens with these creative artists, architects, and what we sometimes, I think, wrongly call ordinary people who are involved in the design and construction of our built and natural environments. Talented architects generally play and improvise as one of the ways they open themselves up. They then focus on a project they're designing on, but in between there is always a sense of openness to new ideas and a certain playful quality that is exciting. Now, this comes through in travel, and sometimes it's a very important thing to consider. As historians, we will follow architects' itineraries and study their sketches or photos. But let's be honest, architects sometimes fabricate what a building or a village is about, what made it become the way it was. And that certainly happened with the number of architects who genuinely were moved by Dogon villages. Anthropologists keep saying they were wrong, but they learned something as architects by what they were trying to understand. So we as architectural historians can study that without taking them too seriously. This is one of the, I think, brilliant insights of Jorge Otero Paez's iconoclastic book, Architecture's Historical Turn. Now, this takes us to another realm of being wrong. Several years ago, Drew Faust, the president of Harvard, surprised me by recommending this book, Being Wrong. And I thought, this is not what I would have thought the president of Harvard would say. But in fact, our mistakes, past and present, are usually invisible to us. Human beings go to great lengths to deny them and to suppress evidence that contradicts our beliefs or our prestige. We know that the sciences grow by refuting earlier theories about the world, but most scientists don't see themselves as part of that process of being about to be refuted. So we need to think about history and aesthetics as evolving in a way in which we too may find ourselves wrong and find that to be acceptable. As William James once said, we should see our errors with a certain lightness of heart. Sometimes I think that these thoughts about play follow Guy Debord's remarkable Dérive or Psychogeographies, in which he was imagining how people move through space in cities, what are possible intellectual, spatial, and social connections. Other times, they seem closer to the realm of language. Like young children, we're bound to make mistakes as we learn a language. It's an adventure, in part because we discover particularities and irregularities in every language that we learn. This, if you don't know it, oh, I'm sorry, this one didn't come through either. This is not coming across. Well, there's a wonderful book that's called L'Architecture des mots de la ville, the architecture or the adventure of words about cities, a compendium that traces the etymology and the ongoing associations of words we easily take for granted as being direct translations. Words like house and housing and boulevard and slum, altogether 100 terms looking at the word that is used in English, distinguishing British and American English, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese for Brazil, German, and Arabic. And we see how these radically different etymologies infuse ongoing associations, giving a different sense of meaning in each language. We can look at verb tenses in the same way. The future anterior imagines looking back at the present from a point in the distant future. Or the conditional and subjunctive tenses show doubt and ambiguity. It's intriguing that English now rarely uses the subjunctive, but of course, all the Romance languages use it to speak of dreams and hopes, suppositions, and disbeliefs. Play is also a way in which people learn to collaborate. And I don't know why these are not coming up. They were the work before, but anyway. This was part of the homage that I want to make to Barry Bergdahl, who, to my mind, this former president of the SAH, who went on to be the curator of architecture at MoMA, oversaw exhibitions, and in particular Home Delivery and the exhibition that just recently opened up on Latin America, that bring about this sense of collaboration as serious play, exploring different possibilities in terms of the people who were brought together, ones who were known and far less known, looking at, for the show on prefab, looking at construction companies that were builders as well as architects' designs, and in the process, bringing people who wouldn't have gone to MoMA to be thinking differently about architecture. He was remarkably effective. And so my advice to all of you is to cut loose, to experiment, to embrace a little risk, to play with possibilities we hadn't thought of. There's no chance that anyone here will become overly lackadaisical. So we can search out opportunities we haven't yet explored to help us imagine expanded and even alternative visions of the past, the present, and the future. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gwen. I think we have time for just one or two questions. We don't have the mic right now, but if there's a loud voice with a burning question, we can take that. Or if not, one at the back here.
Yes, I was wondering, looking at this last picture, why is the past always
It's a wonderful thought that maybe we look at a sense of the possibilities of the left and the involvement of the left in describing how history happened in the past, and we think it may be overshadowed in the future, which I hope is not the case. But it's very striking. Is there one more question? Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, Ken.